Do you think castles were warm? In fact, they were ice-cold prisons. When we see medieval castles in movies, they seem cozy and warm. Huge fireplaces, burning torches, rich carpets. But the reality was quite different. Real medieval castles were stone refrigerators where people froze even in summer. How did people survive in such conditions? How did they keep warm, sleep, and work in these ice castles? They had secrets that we have forgotten. Survival techniques in the cold that worked without electricity or gas heating. Today, we will reveal 10 ingenious ways that medieval people turned stone refrigerators into livable fortresses. Watch until the end. The last method is so effective that it could heat an entire castle with just one heat source. The main and most common method of heating medieval castles was metal braziers, portable stoves that could be placed in almost any room. The brazier was filled with hot coals from the main hearth in the kitchen or hall and carried to wherever heat was needed. This method was simple, versatile, and allowed heat to be maintained even in huge stone halls. In the Middle Ages, braziers often became not only household items, but also works of art. Particularly richly decorated examples were ordered by noble families. Blacksmiths made them with filigree carvings and covered them with ornaments in the form of animals, plants, geometric patterns, or the owner's coats of arms. However, decorativeness was only an additional feature. First and foremost, they were valued for their convenience, safety, and efficiency. Braziers were made of iron or bronze, and sometimes more expensive alloys were used. The design was thought out to the smallest detail. Tall legs prevented the brazier from burning through the wooden floor, and the lattice walls contributed to the even distribution of heat. A lid was placed on top, which not only protected against falling coals, but also allowed the intensity of the fire to be regulated. The size of braziers varied greatly depending on their purpose. Small ones, the size of a plate, could be held directly on the knees or used as hand warmers. Medium-sized ones were placed near beds, desks, or workplaces. Large braziers reaching the size of a modern bedside table could heat an entire room. Thus, braziers served as both personal heaters and a full-fledged source of heat for large rooms. One properly prepared brazier could heat a room of up to 20 square meters for 4-6 hours. It all depended on the quality of the charcoal. If it was made from oak or beech and carefully calcined, it smoldered for a long time and evenly, giving off a lot of heat with minimal smoke. Preparing charcoal was a separate technology that required experience. Firewood was stacked in special earthen pits or charcoal kilns, where it was burned without access to air. This produced charcoal that was light but extremely calorific and produced almost no smoke. Without it, the use of braziers indoors would have been impossible. Braziers became one of the symbols of medieval life. Without them, even the richest stone castles would have remained cold and damp, as stone walls did not retain heat well. It was these simple but ingenious designs that allowed people to live in relative comfort in the harsh conditions of the Middle Ages. While metal braziers required the skill of blacksmiths and were primarily available to wealthy castle owners, heated stones and bricks became a universal and simple way to keep warm for all inhabitants of the fortress. This method did not require expensive equipment, which is why it was actively used by both the nobility and servants. Modern research confirms that this method could raise the temperature in bed by 15-20 degrees, turning an icy bed into a warm and cozy place. Stones and bricks were placed in the main hearth or in a large fireplace, usually located in the kitchen or hall. It took 2-3 hours to heat up, and it was very important to choose the right material. Smooth river cobblestones without cracks were suitable. They could withstand prolonged heating and retained heat evenly. If there were hidden cracks in the stone, it could suddenly burst or even explode, scattering into fragments and causing serious injuries. That is why choosing the right stones was an art form mastered by experienced servants. The hot stones were wrapped in thick fabric, wool or sheepskin, and used as warmers for the hands, feet, and body. It was important to maintain a balance. The fabric had to be thick enough to protect the skin from burns, but at the same time allow soft, even heat to pass through. Sometimes, instead of fabric, old furs or even special bags sewn from rough leather were used. One heated brick weighing 2-3 kilograms retained heat for 6 to 8 hours. It could be placed in bed an hour before bedtime to warm up the icy sheets, or kept on the lap while working at a table or doing needlework. In some castles, there was a whole ritual. Servants prepared night stones in advance and laid them out in their masters' beds, turning the bedtime routine into a small ritual of warmth and comfort. Archaeological finds confirm the popularity of this method. At Warwick Castle in England, special recesses were found in fireplaces designed to heat stones, and nearby were the remains of thick woolen fabrics used to wrap them. This clearly shows that the system was well established and widespread. Foot warmers were especially popular. The stone floors of castles remained icy even in warm shoes, and people constantly suffered from cold feet. Small flat stones, heated and wrapped in cloth, became a real salvation. They were placed in shoes under a cloak or directly under the feet in bed. For convenience, special devices were invented. Wooden boxes with holes for hot stones. Hot cobblestones were placed in such boxes, and slots for feet were located on top. A person would sit down to work or write and receive constant heat from below. This was especially important for scribes, monks, and craftsmen who sat motionless at their desks for hours. To survive the long winter nights, several stones of different sizes were prepared. While one gradually cooled down, another was heated in the hearth, and so the warmth was maintained until morning. Skilled servants monitored this rotation so that their masters would not experience any discomfort. Over time, wealthy families acquired more sophisticated devices, metal containers for hot coals, which became the precursors of modern hot water bottles. However, even the simplest stones worked just as well and were available to everyone, regardless of wealth. Archaeologists have also made interesting discoveries in the women's quarters of castles. Small round stones with holes have been found there. Strings were threaded through these holes, and the stones could be worn on the chest or in the hands as a kind of jewelry. These improvised warm amulets kept the ladies warm during long ceremonies in cold halls and helped them survive the harsh winters. Thus, the use of heated stones and bricks became one of the simplest yet most ingenious ways of heating a medieval castle. They combined affordability, reliability, and versatility, transforming cold stone walls into a more habitable space. When the hearths in the castle went out and the coals in the braziers burned out, the most reliable source of heat was the human body. Sleeping in large groups was not only a tradition, but also a vital means of survival in the harsh conditions of stone fortresses. One bed could accommodate 6 to 8 people, parents, children, servants, and even guests. Sleeping together turned people into a kind of living hot water bottle, and it was this method that became the last line of defense against the cold. Modern research shows that the human body at rest emits about 100 watts of heat. This means that 8 people in one bed generated almost a kilowatt of energy, about the same as a modern medium-power electric heater. In the absence of central heating, this heat was invaluable and literally saved lives in winter. In medieval castles, the concept of a private bedroom as we know it today was virtually non-existent. Even noble families often slept in large halls with several beds placed side by side. Everyone lay close to their neighbors, sharing their body heat. In such a situation, there was no question of personal space. The common goal was to survive the cold night. Archaeological finds confirm these practices. For example, the remains of a bed about 4 meters wide were found in Conway Castle in Wales. It could easily accommodate 10-12 people. Inventory lists of 13th century castles mention large beds for the whole family, which once again emphasizes the importance of collective sleep. The size of medieval beds is truly impressive. Some were up to 3 meters wide and 2.5 meters long. Such a bed could accommodate an entire family of 8, 10 people, along with servants. Mattresses were stuffed with feathers, sheep's wool, or dry straw, which helped retain heat longer and created a soft barrier between the body and the icy wooden floor. Bed linen was also of particular importance. First, a linen sheet was spread out for hygiene reasons. Then several layers of woolen blankets were placed on top. Fur blankets made of sheepskin, wolf, or bear skins were placed on top. Together, this turned the bed into a real warm capsule, trapping human heat inside. The internal distribution of sleepers also had its own logic. Children always slept between adults, receiving warmth from both sides. This was not only practical, but also safe. The little ones were protected from drafts and accidental cold. The elderly and sick were usually placed in the center, where the temperature was highest, surrounded by healthy adults. Young men lay down at the edges like a shield, protecting the others from cold air currents. Over time, a kind of etiquette for sleeping together developed. Everyone knew their place. Strong men at the edges, women and children in the middle. Violating this order was perceived not simply as tactlessness, but as a threat to the common survival. On particularly cold nights, servants or casual guests could join the family. At such moments, social differences were erased. A count could find himself in the same bed next to a stable boy, because warmth became more important than class boundaries. Thick curtains made of wool or heavy cloth, which surrounded the bed, served as an additional means of retaining heat. Such curtains turned the bed into a small house within a house, protecting sleepers from the icy drafts that swept through the corridors. Even if the room itself remained cold, a stable and warmer space was maintained inside the curtained bed. Thus, collective sleeping was not a manifestation of romanticism or a lack of culture, but a time-tested survival system. It allowed people to live and stay healthy in conditions where no artificial heating could provide sufficient warmth. In the stone halls of castles, where drafts blew even through thick walls, the main shield against the cold was not architecture, but clothing. Medieval people understood that heat is preserved not only by fire, but also by a properly constructed layer of fabric. Layering was their main secret. They wore 7-8 layers of clothing, creating air pockets between the fabrics. This principle is still used in modern mountaineering and winter equipment. The first layer was almost always a linen shirt. Linen absorbed moisture well and dried quickly, preventing hypothermia. Even in burials, archaeologists find linen fabrics in relatively good condition, confirming their durability. The second layer was a woolen tunic. Wool was considered the best natural insulator. Its fibers created millions of microscopic air pockets that retained heat. Thick wool protected from the cold better than fur because it not only kept you warm, but also allowed the skin to breathe. Long cloaks or capes often served as the third layer. They were sewn from thick wool or felt, and the fabric was impregnated with animal fats for a water-repellent effect. Such a cloak could withstand both rain and snow, becoming the medieval equivalent of a modern membrane jacket. The wealthy could afford fur items, fur coats and fur-lined cloaks made of beaver, sable, and marten. The fur was worn on the inside against the body to keep the heat in. Beaver skins were especially prized. They kept you warmer than sheep's wool and were a symbol of high status. At Edinburgh Castle, archaeologists found a 14th century women's dress consisting of 12 layers of fabric, linen undershirts, several layers of wool of varying thickness, and an upper cape lined with fur. This shows that fashion and practicality were intertwined in clothing. Women looked elegant, but at the same time were effectively protected from the cold. Special attention was paid to headwear. It is known that up to 40% of body heat is lost through the head. Therefore, even inside castles, people did not take off their hoods, caps, bonnets, and fur hats. The wealthy wore expensive fur items, while the common people wore thick woolen hoods sewn onto their cloaks. Footwear was also adapted to the cold. Leather boots were lined with fur or wool and greased on the outside to protect against moisture. Several pairs of woolen stockings were worn inside, which were attached to the belt so that they would not slip down. Hands were protected by double layers of gloves. First, soft leather gloves with fur lining were worn, and woolen mittens were worn on top. This allowed people to work without losing heat. Interestingly, the nobility had something similar to medieval thermal underwear. Thin woolen pants and shirts that fit snugly to the body. They created a base layer of insulation, over which the rest of the clothing was worn. Women had a special advantage. Their long dresses and skirts formed a whole thermal tent around their legs. Several woolen skirts could be worn under a dress, creating multi-layered protection and allowing them to stay warm, even in icy halls. Thus, clothing in the Middle Ages was not just an element of status or fashion, but a real tool for survival. Each layer had its own purpose, and together they created reliable protection that allowed people to live and work in conditions where the temperature in the castle rarely rose above 10 degrees Celsius. The stone castles of the Middle Ages were beautiful and impressive, but completely unsuitable for living without proper insulation. Their walls were frozen through, the floors were cold, and drafts blew through every crack. The solution was fabrics, carpets, tapestries, and draperies, which served as both decoration and practical insulation. Modern research using thermal imaging cameras has shown that properly hung fabrics can raise the temperature in a room by 8–10 degrees. For a medieval castle, this was the difference between freezing cold and tolerable warmth. Stone walls were covered with carpets and tapestries from floor to ceiling. This created an air gap that worked like modern insulation. The thicker and fluffier the carpet, the more effectively it retained heat. In Cluny Castle in France, tapestries 3–4 centimeters thick have been preserved to this day, which serve both as works of art and reliable insulation. Archaeologists at Carnarvon Castle, Wales, discovered the remains of special fastenings for fabrics. The walls were covered with several layers, a coarse woolen base at the bottom and decorative tapestries at the top. The result was a real fabric wall that kept out the cold. Windows are the main enemies of heat. In wealthy castles, there was a whole system of protection: wooden shutters, a layer of stretched ox bladders instead of glass, and thick wool or fur curtains on top. In terms of efficiency, this design could rival modern double-glazed windows. At night, the gaps were additionally sealed with rags or felt. The floors were covered with a thick layer of straw, which acted as a natural insulator and prevented the cold from the stone reaching the feet. Carpets and animal skins, bear, wolf, and deer, were laid on top. The richest castles could use expensive oriental carpets. The straw was changed every week to prevent insects from breeding in the rooms and to maintain freshness. The beds were hung with heavy wool and velvet curtains. This created a small, warm house inside the cold room, where the heat of human bodies was preserved. Some castles even had special sleeping tents inside the rooms. A wooden frame was covered with thick fabric, turning it into a cozy corner for noble ladies or sick people. Even doorways were covered with carpets instead of wooden doors. This made it easy to move from room to room and at the same time kept out the cold air from the corridors. In large castles, such fabric partitions served as a kind of thermal lock. In the fall, many castles performed a special ritual called warming. Servants hung tapestries, laid out skins, and installed curtains and draperies. This event was almost festive in nature. The castle seemed to be dressed in winter clothes, preparing to survive the long cold spell. In the spring, all the fabrics were removed, cleaned, and stored in chests until the next season. Thus, fabrics in a medieval castle were not only an element of luxury, but also a functional warming system that transformed stone halls into rooms more or less suitable for living. The sixth way to keep warm in cold castles was to use domestic animals as living heaters. In an era when people did not have central heating or sophisticated engineering solutions, it was often proximity to animals that saved them from the cold. People and livestock living together was not a whim or a sign of poverty. It was a necessity of life, developed over centuries of survival in a harsh climate. Dogs played a special role in the living heating system. They were allowed into bedrooms and even put directly into bed. There are references to warming dogs, large breeds with thick fur that were kept in castles specifically for warmth. Newfoundlands, mastiffs, and huge sheepdogs were considered invaluable, not only as guards but also as living stoves. On cold nights, several such dogs curled up next to their owner could warm the whole family. There was even a belief that sleeping with a dog protected not only from the cold, but also from evil spirits who were supposedly afraid of their breath. Cats also served an important function as household heaters. They found the warmest places in the house, crawled under the blanket, and warmed not only themselves but also the people. Old chronicles mention that cats served as living draft detectors. Wherever a cat sat, the owners paid attention, understanding where the walls or windows were letting in the cold. A cozy sleep with several cats under a fur blanket was common in the castles of Northern Europe. But it wasn't just dogs and cats. Goats, sheep, and even cows were kept on the lower floors of castles or in specially designated rooms. Their warmth rose upward, creating natural convection and heating the living quarters. In some fortresses, the remains of wooden floors with holes through which warm air from animals' roes have been found. In Dover Castle, archaeologists found entire utility rooms built directly under the living quarters. In winter, this turned the basement into a kind of living boiler that worked without firewood. Not only large livestock, but also birds were used for warmth. Chickens, ducks, and geese lived directly in the rooms or next to them. They gave off heat and at the same time provided the family with fresh eggs. Geese were especially valued. They were kept in bedrooms not only for warmth, but also for their down and feathers, which were used to make the warmest blankets and pillows. To this day, goose down is considered one of the best natural insulators, and this tradition dates back to those times. Stables were also often built under living quarters or built into the walls of the castle. Horses give off a tremendous amount of heat, and all medieval builders knew this. At Winchester Castle, for example, traces of channels and holes in the walls have been preserved, through which warm air from the stables entered the rooms above. This animal ventilation turned the stable into a real natural boiler, heating the entire floor. Interestingly, even mice and rats, which were usually considered enemies, were sometimes tolerated in the Middle Ages. Their numerous colonies in the walls and floors of castles created an additional layer of living insulation. The massive rodents retained heat, and old chronicles mention that rats warmed the walls. Of course, the owners of the castles fought against them, but in harsh winters they were more tolerant of their presence. Thus, domestic animals in a medieval castle were not only a source of food or guards, but also part of the heating system. Their warmth was used consciously, creating entire architectural solutions that took into account the proximity of livestock and people. This was one of the oldest and most reliable ways to keep warm, ensuring survival in stone halls where temperatures could drop below zero, even indoors. The seventh way to keep warm in a cold castle was to consume alcoholic beverages. Wine, ale, and strong liqueurs were considered a reliable way to light an internal fire and survive the frosty days. People and drinks existed in the same survival system. A warm mug in your hands, steam rising from the cup, and a spicy aroma created a feeling of comfort where the stone walls exuded an icy chill. It was not just a pleasure, but part of everyday practice, reinforced by habits and seasonal rituals. Mulled wine, hot wine with spices, was the main winter drink. It was prepared on the kitchen stove in jugs or pots, brought almost to a boil, and simmered to make the flavor richer. It was drunk several times a day, in the morning to get the blood flowing, in the afternoon to keep from freezing in the damp halls, and in the evening before bed. Spices, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, black pepper, enhanced the warming effect and counteracted the dampness in the room, while honey softened the taste and added calories. Ale and beer were consumed warm. Cold drinks stole body heat, but warm drinks maintained a feeling of warmth and strength. Honey, ginger, cinnamon, and sometimes fragrant herbs were added to jugs to create sweet and spicy winter versions. Tavern records often mention boiled beer. Hostesses kept a separate pot by the hearth so that guests could quickly warm up their mugs. Strong herbal tinctures were considered a remedy for cold and dampness. They were infused with alcohol or strong wine with pepper, ginger, cloves, juniper, and wormwood. Such infusions were given in small doses, a sip at a time, as a remedy for colds, joint pain, and winter blues. Monastery infirmaries and herbalists had their own recipes, where dosages and combinations of herbs were passed down as professional secrets. Even children were given weak ale instead of water as a safer and more caloric drink. It was low in alcohol and served in small portions, a few sips with porridge or soup. This provided extra calories to keep warm and was part of the general diet during the cold season. On weekdays, it was a nutritious drink, and on holidays, it was sweetened with honey. Before bedtime, warm wine or ale was practiced almost everywhere. A cup of warm drink warmed the blood, relaxed the muscles, and helped to fall asleep in a cold bed. The morning often began with a small sip of warm ale for vigor, especially before working in the yard or in unheated workshops. These were small daily rituals that created a sense of control over the harsh winter. That is why wine, ale, and herbal tinctures became so firmly established in castle life, complementing braziers, hot stones, curtains, and layered clothing. The eighth way to keep warm in a cold castle was constant physical activity. Medieval people could not afford to sit idle because any inactivity meant rapid cooling of the body and the risk of illness. Movement was a natural way to maintain body temperature and was perceived as an integral part of life. As early as the 13th, 14th centuries, doctors wrote in their treatises that heat is generated by the movement of blood, long before science formulated the laws of thermodynamics. Morning exercises became a real ritual. Immediately after waking up, all the inhabitants of the castle, from the lord to the simple servant, got up and performed the warm-up movements. These could be squats, bends, arm swings, brisk walking around the hall, or running in place. Such activities helped to get the blood flowing, warm up the muscles, and prepare the body for a hard day. In some castles, morning exercises were organized, almost like a mandatory routine, with the senior member setting the pace. Physical labor permeated everyday life. Castle life was structured so that people were constantly on the move. Servants carried water from the well to the kitchen, firewood from the yard to the halls, and food from the cellars to the chambers. Women and girls washed clothes in ice-cold water, spun yarn, prepared food, and cleaned the rooms. Even the simple task of tending the fire in the braziers required constant effort. All this prevented the body from freezing and created a feeling of warmth without a fire or blankets. Even mental work was associated with movement. Scribes and copyist monks could not sit still for hours. Monastery rules included instructions to get up every hour, bend over, and stretch your arms and neck. This was vital for working by candlelight and on cold stone benches. Entire exercise routines for copyists have been preserved, rotating the wrists, opening and closing the fingers, and turning the torso. Dancing served a dual purpose: entertainment and warmth. In the evenings, communal dance gatherings were held in the main halls. People spun, jumped, clapped their hands, and sang. It was a joyful event that turned into a real heater for all participants. Medieval dances, the carol, saltarello, and estampa, were energetic and rhythmic, sometimes resembling running or marching. An hour of dancing warmed a person up so much that they could feel warm for several more hours, even in a damp room. Combat training for knights and squires was also a way to keep warm. Even in winter, training with swords, spears, and bows continued. Heavy armor, prolonged weapon exercises, running and wrestling caused a strong rush of blood, which made the warriors hardened. Training in the yard in the cold was both a school of endurance and a way to warm up through force. Working outside in winter also had a warming effect. Men chopped wood, cleared snow from roofs and yards, tended to animals in pens, and hunted in the forest. All these activities not only supported the household, but also provided natural warmth for the body. Even in the cold, people went outside without fear. Active activity warmed them better than sitting by the fire. Women also found a remedy for the cold in their daily chores. Washing, weaving, cleaning rooms, working at the spinning wheel, all of this required movement. Women's quarters were considered especially warm. Women did not sit idle and were almost always engaged in physical work, which created a lively warmth in the room. Children were not left out. There were special warming games for them: blind man's buff, tag, wrestling, rolling on the floor. These active entertainments were both education and a way to survive. Children were less prone to colds because their bodies were constantly trained to resist the cold through play and running around. Even in religious rituals, movement played a role. During long prayers, monks stood up, bowed, and walked in circles to keep from freezing in the cold chapels. Processions, marches, and collective singing also warmed the participants. As a result, constant physical activity was not just a habit, but a fundamental strategy for survival within stone walls. Where braziers and warm blankets were only a temporary aid, movement became the main source of heat. Every step, every effort, every dance or sword stroke turned into a small heater, without which a medieval castle would quickly turn into an icy prison. The ninth way to keep warm in a cold castle was to constantly consume hot food and drinks. In the Middle Ages, food was not only a source of energy, but also the main tool for maintaining internal heat. People understood perfectly well that cold bread or water from a well only cooled the body, while hot dishes and warming drinks turned into a kind of internal bonfire. Breakfast was always warm and nutritious. It was prepared in advance. Porridge and soup simmered all night in large cauldrons on the kitchen fire. Early in the morning, they were distributed in bowls to servants, children, and masters. Ordinary porridge with honey, butter, or spices not only satisfied hunger, but also stimulated blood circulation, helping people to tolerate the icy air in the stone halls more easily. Frumenti, a thick wheat porridge with milk, eggs, and spices, was particularly popular. It was served in large wooden bowls, which kept the food warm longer. One serving could keep a person warm for almost the entire day. Lunch was built around hot soups, stews, and braised meat. The fattier the dish, the longer it kept the body warm. Lard, butter, fatty meat, and legumes were considered not just food, but a kind of winter pharmacy. During this period, thick soups were especially prized. Potage, a thick broth made from meat, vegetables, and beans, and mortariu, a spicy soup with garlic and lots of spices. Such dishes warmed you from the inside, were filling, and their spicy taste made the body warm up even more. Dinner was also warm and filling. During the cold season, no one ate cold dishes. Even bread was placed on the grates of the hearth so that it would be served warm. In the evening, people often ate meat dishes, stewed vegetables, or hot pies, which were easy to make in advance and stayed warm until serving. A simple rule worked flawlessly. Warm food meant a warm body, while cold food could sap a person's strength. Hot drinks were essential throughout the day. Herbal decoctions, teas made from chamomile, rose hips, and mint, warm milk with honey, and hot broths made from bones and meat all helped maintain body temperature and combat the cold. In wealthy castles, there was even a special position called beverage warmer. His duty was to ensure that the hosts and guests always had a warm cup at hand. For this purpose, thick-walled ceramic or metal jugs were used, which kept the heat for hours. Spices played a special role in the warming diet. They not only added flavor to food, but also actually increased blood circulation, causing a rush of heat. In the morning, invigorating ginger and cinnamon were added. In the afternoon, pepper and cloves were added to aid in the digestion of fatty foods. And in the evening, nutmeg and cardamom were added to calm and create a feeling of warmth in the body. During winter meals, spices were used particularly generously and were valued literally as much as gold. Garlic and onions were considered essential winter foods. They were eaten both raw and in soups, stews, and infusions. People believed that these foods not only warmed them up, but also protected them from colds. The chronicles of monastery kitchens mention recipes for winter stews, in which garlic was no less important than meat. Hot pies were one of the favorite winter dishes. They could be filled with meat, vegetables, or grains, and the dough acted as a natural thermos that retained heat. Such a pie could both feed and warm a person. It was often taken along on trips or hunting. Sometimes the pie was placed directly in the hands of a child or an elderly person to warm their palms until it cooled down. Thus, the warming cuisine of the Middle Ages was built as a whole system. Hot meals in the morning, afternoon, and evening, constant drinks, spices, and fatty foods not only satisfied hunger, but also protected the body from the cold. Food and drink in the castle served as internal heating, without which life within the stone walls would have been impossible. The 10th and most important secret to keeping warm in a medieval castle was the proper use of the central hearth. This huge fireplace in the main hall served not only as a source of fire, but as the true heart of the castle, both literally and symbolically. Modern reconstructions have shown that a properly constructed hearth could heat a room of up to 300 square meters, transforming a cold stone hall into a relatively warm and habitable space. The size of the hearth was impressive. It was 4 meters wide, about 2 meters high, and 1.5 meters deep. Such a space allowed whole logs up to 2 meters long and as thick as a human body to be burned. The fire in such a fireplace burned with unprecedented power, and the flames rose to human height. the hearth became the visible center of the hall, around which the entire life of the castle was built. The construction of the hearth required skill. Its base was laid out of particularly durable refractory stones, and its walls were made of specially fired bricks that could withstand high temperatures. The chimney was designed so that the smoke rose slowly, giving maximum heat to the walls rather than escaping immediately into the sky. In some castles, the chimney system included entire channels running inside the walls, heating the upper floors like invisible radiators. The hearth was heated continuously from autumn to spring. The season usually began in October and lasted until April. Firewood was added every 2 to 3 hours to keep the flames burning. At night, special servants, known as firekeepers, stood guard over the fire, ensuring that life in the castle did not freeze along with the extinguished hearth. For the owners and servants, the hearth was not only a source of warmth, but also a symbol of stability. As long as the fire burned, life continued. Chimneys functioned as a primitive form of central heating. Hot air and smoke rose through special shafts, passing through walls and ceilings, heating them from within. Sometimes several channels led from a single hearth, and the heat spread to dozens of rooms. As a result, a single fireplace could heat an entire floor of the castle. Medieval engineers knew how to make a hearth a heat accumulator. For this purpose, special types of stone were used, which slowly accumulated heat during the day and released it at night. Even if the fire went out, the walls around the fireplace remained hot for several more hours, creating a feeling of warmth. Thus, the central hearth was not just a fireplace, but the true heart of the castle. It combined the functions of a kitchen, a heating system, a place for socializing, and even a spiritual center where all the inhabitants gathered. Without it, life in the cold stone halls would have been impossible. The hearth fire is a symbol of life in a medieval castle, its main secret to warmth and comfort in the harsh winter. Medieval castles were indeed cold stone fortresses, but the people of that time did not simply endure the cold. They created a whole system of survival in harsh conditions. Each of the 10 ways of heating was part of an overall strategy. Braziers warmed individual rooms, hot water bottles warmed beds, clothing warmed people's bodies, animals warmed living quarters, activity warmed muscles, and hot food warmed the body from within. These cold weather survival techniques worked without electricity, gas, or modern heaters. People relied on fire, natural materials, their own ingenuity, and mutual assistance. Many of these methods can still be used today. In the event of a heating failure, at a cottage without gas, or in camping conditions, medieval secrets of warmth can save you from freezing. The main lesson from medieval experience is that heat must be created, preserved, and distributed. One source is not enough. You need a system of many small solutions that work together. Modern people have forgotten how to survive in the cold without technology. But medieval experience shows that people can live comfortably, even in the harshest conditions, if they know the right ways to keep warm. Which of the medieval heating methods did you find most practical? Have you tried to keep warm without modern heating? Share your experience in the comments.